Welcome back, everybody, to the series where I talk about the Iliad. And by everybody, I mean the small number of people who probably clicked into this video, because not a lot of people watched my video about book one. It got about 10% of the views as most of my successful videos, so it is what it is. I enjoy making these, so I'm going to keep doing it. And I think a number of people say that they really get something out of these, and I would rather make something that I enjoy and that people really learn something from for a smaller group of people than just throw out fluff with mass appeal. You know, I'm going to do these in between other videos because I don't want to totally destroy the analytics of my channel, but I want to keep this up. So hopefully you get something out of this. If you're new here, hopefully if you stick around a minute, you'll find this kind of interesting. If you haven't seen book one, you can find a link in the description and maybe up here. I'm really not sure if and when I was pointing in the right direction. But in short, book one had a giant argument between Agamemnon, the leader of the Achaean army, and Achilles, its greatest hero. This created a rift in the army and left things looking pretty dire. Today we're going to cover book two, which is about the fallout of all this drama. So it has some pretty interesting twists and turns, some good dramatic moments. But it also has something called the Catalog of the Ships, which is literally just the story listing off who was in the Achaean army, how many men were in each contingent, what ships they came on, and stuff like that. So it's really incredibly boring, and we're going to skip it. Because of this, our coverage of book two will be fairly short, so I'm going to use the extra time to bring us all up to date on the origin of the Trojan War, how we basically get up to the Iliad. So I hope you enjoy. Before getting started, I first want to thank a couple people who helped make this video just a little bit better. First is Gareth Hinds, who very graciously allowed me to use images from his comic book adaptation of the Iliad. And second is Ian Johnston, who has a free translation of the full Iliad online, free for everybody to use. And that's where I get the little excerpts I show you in the video. I would recommend both of those as resources if you want to get a little more into the Iliad than you would just by watching videos about it. Gareth's is a very good comic book adaptation. It's true to the material and easy to read. Ian Johnston, it is the full Iliad, so it's not easy just to sit down and read like a novel, but it's great if you just want to get a feel of what the actual verse is like. So I would check both of those out. But now on to the actual backstory of the Iliad. People generally think of the Iliad as a story about the Trojan War. And this is arguably true to the extent that it's set in the Trojan War and has a lot of big battles between its greatest heroes, but it doesn't really cover the entire war. It just throws us into the action, as we saw last time, then covers a few weeks of the war's 10th year and suddenly stops without showing us how it ends. Now this might sound weird at a glance, like why would a story about the Trojan War skip almost the whole thing and just give us this little tiny splinter in time? But this is really pretty conventional storytelling even by modern standards. If you were to watch a movie, say, about the Vietnam War, it's not going to tell the whole span about how the war started and how the whole course of it went and stuff like that. It's usually going to zoom in on specific characters and tell their story. That's what the Iliad's doing. So once you think of it that way, it actually kind of makes sense. I think it's more expected than we think when we don't approach it to chronicle a whole war, which most entertainment even today doesn't do. That said, I think it does go out of its way to take as many elements of the Trojan War as it can and compress them into this small time. It gives us a sampling of a lot of different kinds of battle sequences. It shows us as many characters as it can, gives us as many iconic scenes as it can within that time. So it's almost like it artificially takes things that would have happened across that span of 10 years and just compresses them. So it's almost like within this one small story that is about a specific person and his journey, for the most part, Achilles, I think it tries to allude to as much as it can. However, you're not going to get the whole actual story by reading it. This works fine if you're among the ancient Greeks. They didn't need that backstory. It was just ubiquitous within their culture. So if somebody started telling something about, a certain part of the Trojan War, their minds immediately fill in the rest. It's kind of like if you were going to watch Full Metal Jacket. The story would make sense to you without having to have an entire primer about the Vietnam War. However, that's not the case for most people today. Unless you're a big Greek mythology nerd, which a lot of you probably are if you're watching this. So if this is unnecessary for you, go ahead and skip to the time on screen or the next chapter or whatever, and just listen to the part about book two. But a lot of people, I think, would benefit from some just general overview about how the Trojan War started. So here we are. Now, as far as how the war started, I think most people know about Helen of Troy and Paris and all that stuff. Paris was all horny for Helen and started the war by taking her back home to Troy. But this is just one link in a chain of events that goes back way further. And believe it or not, most of those links had to do with horniness. A lot of horniness in this backstory. The first, as far as I can tell, is when Zeus and Poseidon were both horny for a sea nymph named Thetis. You may remember her from book one. This created a couple problems. First and most evidently, you don't want the two most powerful gods on Olympus fighting over a woman, right? But second, and even more to the point, there was a prophecy that Thetis' son would become more powerful than her father. And nobody on Olympus, especially Zeus and Poseidon, wanted a new god more powerful than them all of a sudden showing up. Especially when the whole story of Greek mythology, at least when you go back earlier in time to pre-human times, is a story about children of gods overthrowing their parents and becoming the ruling gods. So nobody wanted this at all. So Zeus and Poseidon suddenly lost interest. You know, that prophecy makes for a pretty good cold shower. The trick, though, is what do you do with her? You don't want another god swooping in and marrying her because even if it's not Zeus and Poseidon, you don't want just sudden new powerful god running around. So they decided to give her to a mortal man named Peleus, because who cares among the gods if a really powerful mortal's running around, right? That's not really a threat to anybody. This is consequential to the Trojan War for a couple reasons. First off, Thetis and Peleus ended up becoming the parents of Achilles. He is the one who is greater than his father, the hero of the Trojan War. Second, their marriage caused the entire Trojan War. And here's how. All of the gods were so relieved to have the Thetis situation diffused that they threw a giant wedding for her and Peleus. And when I say they all, I mean that all of the gods showed up. Except for one, Eris, the goddess of discord, who was conspicuously not invited. Now, obviously, you can see why they wouldn't want her there, right? She is literally the personification of drama and fighting, and you don't want to bring someone like that into the middle of a giant wedding where everybody's trying to have a good time. Unfortunately, ghosting her doesn't make her go away, and she is so mad at being left out that she takes a golden apple inscribed with the words "for the fairest" and threw it into the middle of the wedding. Now, if that sounds weird to you, like something might be lost in cultural translation, just think of that apple as a trophy for the most beautiful goddess. And because the gods of Olympus are so vain, what do you think all the goddesses want more than a trophy saying they're the most beautiful? So as soon as it was thrown into the middle of the party, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite all started fighting over it. And so Eris walked away laughing and saying, "Ha, enjoy your party now, nerds," or something like that. I'm kind of speculating. Anyway, the three goddesses, probably each with one hand locked on the apple, turned to Zeus and asked him to judge who the most beautiful was. Now, Zeus needed just absolutely none of this drama in his life, so he sent them down to Earth to be judged by Paris, Prince of Troy. Now, Paris was out by himself looking after his flocks when three goddesses suddenly appeared and asked him who the most beautiful was. Now, at first he was just kind of freaked out, as I think most people would be. But then once the goddesses calmed him down, he still had a legitimately hard time making his decision, because all of these are like near perfect, beautiful beings from the heavenly realm. So how do you pick one from the other? How can you even conceive of who's most beautiful? So to help resolve this, each of the goddesses offered him a bribe that was consistent with their character or their personality. Hera, being the queen of the gods and Zeus's wife, offered to make him king of a bunch of territory and thus super rich. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and kind of goddess of war, long story there, offered to make him super wise and the greatest hero/fighter in the world. And Aphrodite, goddess of love, offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. Now Paris, being a horny idiot like too many men, picked Aphrodite so he could have a hot chick. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me because I think if you were like, the richest king in the world or the greatest warrior in the world, the woman situation would just kind of work itself out for you, but whatever. The trick was the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen of Sparta, who happened to be already married. Now notice I called her Helen of Sparta and not Helen of Troy. This is because she was married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. And to understand why this is such a precarious situation, we're going to have to rewind just a little bit. First off, the reason Helen exists at all is because Zeus was really horny for her mom, Leda, so he came down looking like a swan and got her pregnant. Long story there. She ends up hatching out of an egg, I think, or something. Really strange. Zeus's libido is just all over this story. Anyway, largely because of this divine birth, Helen was just famously beautiful, and I mean wildly beautiful, like everybody in the world wanted her. In fact, when it was time for her to be married, all the kings in Greece came, at least who were eligible to be married, and they tried to win her hand. They were like offering bribes and gifts to her father Tyndareus to try to win him over so that he'd let her marry them. Problem was, this put Tyndareus in a bit of a pinch. Yeah, I'm sure the popularity was nice, all the bribes were nice and stuff like that. But the trick is, if he selects any of these men, then he's made really good friends with one guy, but he's made enemies with literally everybody else. I guess she was just that hot, everybody was that crazy over her that it created an international incident. So the whole thing just stayed locked in a stalemate, with Tyndareus not picking anybody. Until the world's smartest man, Odysseus, came up with a plan. Now you might recognize Odysseus from the Odyssey. He was also briefly in book 1 of the Iliad. Basically, he's the cleverest of all the Greeks, and every time the Achaeans end up in trouble, he comes up with a solution. In this case, the solution was to have everybody present swear an oath that they would stand behind the marriage of whoever Tyndareus picked to be Helen's husband. Now, I don't know that everybody necessarily loved this idea, like who really liked the idea of standing behind Helen's husband when they didn't get picked. But the trick was, have a 1% chance of winning or have just absolutely no chance because he won't pick anybody. So everybody went along with it. And in the end, Tyndareus or Helen, probably more Tyndareus because I don't think women had a lot of say in choosing their husbands, he ended up choosing Menelaus, king of Sparta. Now this basically locked all the kings of Greece into an alliance where they had to do anything necessary to maintain the marriage of Helen and Menelaus, including going to war. So circling back to Paris, you can probably see where this is going. Helen was his bribe for choosing Aphrodite in the beauty contest, so he went to Sparta when Menelaus wasn't there and took Helen and ran home with her. Now, I'm not really sure about the mechanics of how these two events work with each other. Most narratives I've read just describe the beauty contest and then have him running off with Helen. And the two events almost seem to work on separate planes or something like that. But whatever. The important thing is, when they discovered that he had run off with her, that triggered the alliance of all the kings of Greece, and that alliance would remain in place until they had recovered Helen from Troy. Now, nobody was looking for a massive war, so plan A was diplomacy. Menelaus went to Sparta, he took Odysseus along with him because he's so darn smart, and they were going to try to get the Trojans to send Helen back. The Trojans were not having it. In fact, some accounts have them about to kill Menelaus and Odysseus until someone talked them out of it. But the long and the short of it was they said no. And once it was clear things came down to war, Menelaus' brother Agamemnon went around Greece gathering all the other kings and having them join his army. Now, why Agamemnon? As far as I can tell, it's just because he was the most powerful, richest, and influential of all the kings. Also, the fact that he was Menelaus' brother probably brought him into it. To give some idea of what this looked like, here's a map showing the kingdoms that were involved. Each of the kings who had come to pursue Helen, and thus most of the major heroes of the Iliad, ruled one of these little realms. Think of each one as just a little city-state with a surrounding territory. So Agamemnon and Menelaus had to go around to all these places and tell the local ruler, hey, you need to come join us and fight. Now again, all of these are independent rulers, but their oath kind of locked them into an alliance where they had to sail off and fight with Agamemnon as their commander-in-chief, kind of. A couple people tried to get out of it. Achilles and Odysseus, I think. Yeah, Achilles and Odysseus both tried to get out of it. I don't know if it was Achilles trying to escape as much as his mom trying to hide him, but those are side stories. For the most part, everybody joined them, and they had to gather all their armies, put them on ships, and sell them from here in mainland Greece over to here in Troy and fight this big battle. This set up a war between two sides. On one side was this invading coalition referred to as the Achaeans. They're sometimes colloquially referred to as the Greeks and come from what we see as mainland Greece. And on the other was the city of Troy along with some neighboring allies in what's now Turkey. Now, for all practical purposes, for us as lay people reading these stories, everybody involved was Greek. There are no Greeks versus Trojans for the most part. That might not be 100% accurate, but it works for our purposes. The Trojans speak the Greek language, they worship the same Greek gods as all the other people in the story, so it's not really important to get hung up on. It'll just help if you don't visualize the Trojans as some weird foreign culture that the Greeks are invading or whatever. They're all more or less in the same boat from the perspective of what we as an audience are going to read in the story. They all seem Greek to us. I hope this sets the stage and helps contextualize what we were seeing in Book 1. When Agamemnon and Achilles fought, it was not a fight between a ruler and one of his subjects. It was a fight between two independent rulers, one of whom was kind of the leader of a temporary coalition. And when Achilles stormed off, he was doing more than fracturing an alliance. He was kind of violating his oath if you look at the big picture. I don't think the story really emphasizes that super hard. Zeus doesn't come down on him for it or anything. He sides with him, if anything. But that kind of gives you the big picture of what was going on there. It's also worth mentioning that when they sailed to Troy, they were blocked by unfavorable winds. This happened because Agamemnon had boasted that he was a greater hunter than Artemis, the goddess of a hunt. People are always doing dumb things like that in Greek mythology. So in retaliation, she gave them bad weather that halted the invasion. The whole army just sat there, unable to sail, everybody getting more and more impatient, until finally they consulted Calchas, remember the prophet from Book 1? And he said that Agamemnon would have to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia to fix the winds. Agamemnon did, and so they were able to sail to Troy. Kind of adds a little punch to Agamemnon's complaint in Book 1 that Calchas always prophesies bad news, huh? But sad as it was, they did manage to sail to Troy and hold it under siege, and yada yada yada, 9 years pass, and we get to Book 1 of the Iliad. Now that might sound kind of flippant, But Greek mythology itself does kind of yada 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 those 9 years. It tells us how the war started and how they got there and everything like that. But then after that, those first 9 years of the war are pretty much blank. It doesn't tell a lot of stories about it. So why is this, though? It's kind of hard to tell. It could be that the legend said the war was 10 years and they didn't have 10 years of material to fill it with. Or it could be that there are all kinds of stories about those first 9 years and they were just lost to time. That's the challenge in dealing with religious or mythical traditions. They kind of arise organically. People start telling stories by word of mouth. Some of those stories get more popular, some get less popular, some fall by the wayside for whatever reason. And so this all happens verbally with no written record. By the time something gets put to paper, there's this whole kind of evolutionary survival of the fittest of stories process that's taken place. And so we don't know why there's this blank space in all the stories for whatever reason that they found most interesting or whatever coalesced around the end of the war. Myths are not written by a panel of authors who decide how the story is going to go, so you just kind of end up with what you get and you don't always know why. Anyway, back to the story, here's where we stand at the end of Book 1. Achilles had left the Achaean army because of his fight with Agamemnon, and Zeus promised to help make Agamemnon really sorry he was gone by making the Achaeans lose. Book 2 opens with Zeus tossing and turning in bed, wondering how to make this happen. When suddenly he has this idea. He realizes that right now, with Achilles out of the fighting, the dumbest thing the Achaeans could possibly do is go on the attack. So he tricks Agamemnon into doing just that by sending him a dream saying, hey, right now is actually a good time to attack because, what do you know, all the gods are suddenly on your side. You know, what a liar would say. This is kind of weird because Zeus is often seen as a god of truth and keeping oaths. But remember that the gods are not usually depicted consistently across mythology, so it just kind of is what it is. And when I say Zeus sent a dream, by the way, I mean that he called on a deity named Dream to go tell Agamemnon all that stuff while he's sleeping. Which means that true to form for the Iliad, we get to hear this message 3 times at the start of Book 2. First, Zeus tells Dream to go say it. Second, Dream goes to Agamemnon while he's sleeping and repeats the same thing to him. He does this while standing at Agamemnon's head in the shape of Nestor, who was the oldest and wisest Achaean hero. So I guess that makes it more convincing, but I think we're to understand Agamemnon experienced it in his head while he was sleeping. I don't know, the gods are always kind of intangible and metaphorical in the Iliad. Go back and watch my video about Book 1 for more. And just as a side thing, I love that after that Homer says, "Fool, he had no clue of what Zeus really meant." Because of course he didn't know what Zeus meant. Zeus was lying to him, so the whole point was for him not to understand. Kind of funny to call someone a fool for being lied to, but whatever. Anyway, Agamemnon wakes up and immediately gathers his senior advisors to tell them about his dream. So that's where we get to hear it repeated a third time. Naturally, he thinks this is good news and that the leader should order their men to attack. Pretty much common sense, right? But then he says something less conventional. He says they should test their men by ordering them to go back home. I guess the idea is that the men are supposed to be like, no way, we're tough guys and committed to the cause, so we want to stay and fight. After Agamemnon is done, Nestor stands up and agrees with him. He says we wouldn't believe these kinds of silly dreams coming from just anybody, but because it came from the greatest of all the Achaeans, then it's probably true and we should just go with whatever he dreamed. It kind of makes ancient people sound superstitious and prone to error, but I don't know, interesting glimpse into the past, right? It also seems maybe a little out of character for Nestor, because Agamemnon, at least so far, seems a little bit rash or like he has poor judgment. Nestor's always coming in and bailing him out. So why would he say that this person, just because of the position he happens to have, is to be believed when he has a dream? Seems a little strange. I don't know if he's being sarcastic or what. It's hard to read exactly how to take this, but keep in mind that in the Iliad, the performers or the authors, whether you want to see this as being written down or in its earlier stages of oral performance, are using these kinds of formulas to help make the story easier to recite. And so sometimes I think that formulaic language gets into the mouths of some of the characters. And so this could just be Nestor giving general, hey, somebody in high position is more likely to be believed when they have a dream. They're not going to just tell us something frivolous. I don't know. I don't know how much of that is just supposed to be a general statement through Nestor's mouth and how much of that is supposed to really represent his estimation of Agamemnon. Anyway, the leaders are all in agreement, so they go up before the men for Agamemnon to make his speech, test and all. He tells them that Zeus sent him a dream telling him that they should just give up and go home, which of course is lying about the dream, which itself is a lie. Lie-inception. He carries on and on about how embarrassing this is going to be, but says that this war has just gone on too long, so it's time to finally give up. It's a pretty elaborate and indecisive web of reverse psychology that's pretty much just begging for unpredictable results. And so unpredictable results is exactly what Agamemnon gets. The men immediately degenerate into an unruly mob and run straight to the beach where they start shoving their ships into the water so they can leave. And who would have known? You tell a bunch of soldiers that they get to stop fighting and go home, so they get all excited and try to leave. So nice job, Agamemnon. You played a stupid game and won a stupid prize. Now Hera and Athena see this from up on Olympus and they think it's bad. They're both on the side of the Achaeans, in case you forgot. So Hera turns to Athena and says, "Hey, this is bad, so go do something about it." Athena rushes down to Earth and finds Odysseus standing in the middle of the mob feeling all rough about the whole thing, and she's like, "Hey, don't just stand there looking dejected, stop these guys from leaving." And of course, nobody else saw her, so we could read her words as like, his own little burst of inspiration or whatever. So Odysseus goes over and grabs Agamemnon's staff, which seems like a general symbol of leadership in the Achaean army, so this might not be as audacious as it sounds, and he runs through the army trying to get control over everybody. Every time he sees a leader, he says, "Hey, get a hold of your men, Agamemnon was just trying to test them," and whenever he can get his hands on a common soldier, he literally beats him with a staff and tells him to go sit down. As if the poor guys weren't just doing what Agamemnon had told them to do, but whatever. I guess they deserve a beating for not wanting to keep fighting. But anyway, leader by leader and man by man, Odysseus slowly reverses the human tide and finally the army is assembled. They might not be happy, but at least they're orderly and obedient. Except for one guy, a common soldier named Thersites who stayed standing and kept insulting Agamemnon, like just shouting it out right in front of the assembled army. He just went on and on about how greedy Agamemnon is and how he's just keeping the Achaeans here to get more loot. He mentioned how Agamemnon took Achilles' prize and Achilles just let it happen, then told everybody that they should just leave so he can finally appreciate where all his treasure's coming from. Odysseus shoots back that Thersites shouldn't be insulting kings, then says that if he smarts off again, he'll rip off his clothes and beat him all the way back to the ships. Then he takes the staff and just full-on swings it into Thersites' back, just clubs the out of him. He doubles over crying and all the men start laughing at him. They even say that of all Odysseus' brilliant plans and heroic deeds, this was the best thing he'd ever done. I just thought that line was kind of funny. Now, this is kind of a casual incident, but it sticks out and feels like it was put in the story for a reason, so I think it's worth remarking on before we move forward. For the most part, I think most of us know what's going on here, right? This is an object lesson in talking back to your leaders. This is clearly the product of a very rigidly hierarchical society that doesn't think you should talk back to the royal class. And it depicts Thersites, kind of a stand-in for disorderly commoners, in the most unflattering way humanly possible. He's obnoxious and nobody likes him, and it's pretty clear that the audience is supposed to find satisfaction in him being put in his place and beaten. But there are a few additional details I find interesting here. First is the Iliad's physical description of Thersites. Just indulge me a minute while I read it. Of all the men who came to Troy, he was the ugliest. Bow-legged, one crippled foot, rounded shoulders curving in toward his chest. On top, his pointed head sprouted thin, scraggly tufts of hair. This might seem gratuitous, and it is, but it's interesting how on the nose the Iliad is in its depictions of people. If a character is good and noble, then they're generally going to be written as like well-spoken, wise, good in battle, even physically handsome. Not always, and there is some nuance in people's behavior, but for the most part, if you're in a certain class, it describes you as just unrealistically good in almost every way. If a character is bad to the point of like Thersites, then they're going to be bad in basically every way, including their physical appearance. Again, there's some nuance here. Even the members of the royal class, they have their foibles and their bad things about them. Agamemnon was just kind of an ass in book 1. Achilles was kind of arrogant. But it seems like it's showing them as a whole other class of people who are generally good in every way. Thersites is just human garbage down to his physical appearance, which is just, again, think of how that was written. That's just wild how ugly they make him just for being the outspoken commoner. I guess I don't know that's exactly the reason they put him that way, but feels like what they're going for there. It seems to be a reflection of a mentality that people are just inherently and inalterably desirable or undesirable, and that translates into every part of them down to their physical appearance, but it's kind of hard to say. Another thing that probably sticks out to most of you who are paying attention is how clearly this conversation parallels Agamemnon's and Achilles' conversation in Book 1. In both cases, we have a disorderly challenge to authority during an assembly. Both appeal to Agamemnon's abuse of power, and Thersites even accuses him of keeping the loot and women that other people fought for, just as Achilles had. So it's hard not to see a parallel here, probably an intentional one. Yet Thersites' behavior is seen entirely different from Achilles' behavior. Why is this? At first glance, it seems like it's an issue of class. Like Achilles was kind of out of line, but at least it seemed like he had a place in the conversation. The story insinuates that he had some reasonable cause. When Thersites steps up and says basically the same thing, he's seen as nothing but trash, totally irredeemable, nobody likes anything about him at all, and he is 100% wrong. Now, of course, just in how he presents himself, he comes off as just really obnoxious trash, and you could see him as possibly co-opting Achilles' plight for popularity or getting people's attention or just being a mocker. But to whatever extent that's true, remember he was written that way. So it seems that, according to the story, his main crime is just speaking above his station. And this is reinforced by the third and final point I wanted to make about this, which is how Odysseus responds. He doesn't justify Agamemnon, doesn't explain why the army should stay and fight. He just tells him to shut his mouth and quit being sassy, then threatens him. Then just beat him right where he stood. And remember, this is Odysseus, the cleverest and most articulate of all the Achaeans. So he's probably not speaking from a lack of imagination. It seems like he just doesn't think that he needs to dignify remarks from a commoner like this, and so he doesn't. Now, I'm not here to make a big thing about this. It's obviously not in line with current modern-day values, especially if you're at all progressive. It's just interesting as a relic of its time, and if you want to see how I approach that, you can look back at Book 1. Anyway, Odysseus then turns to the assembly and gives this big, rousing speech, kind of like a locker room speech in a sports movie, where he hypes the army by doing everything from talking about the righteousness of their cause to telling them how ashamed they'll be if they give up now. He even reminds them of a prophecy Calchas gave about how they'll win the war in the 10th year, so they just need to hang in there a little bit longer. This works and the army cheers and everybody decides they're going to stay and fight. So well done, Odysseus. But Nestor didn't really think this was all necessary. He literally calls the army a bunch of babies and says that they shouldn't need Odysseus to get them all hyped up so they'll be excited to fight. He says they should just stay and do it because they're supposed to and it's their duty. Oaths were given and they're obligated and you just need to stay and listen. He even says that they should stay until the Achaeans get revenge for Helen by having sex with all of the Trojans' wives. So another kind of horrifying look into the culture of the time. Again, these guys are basically the third world warlords of their time. But getting back on track, the overall point is that they're just supposed to buck it up and obey without having to be inspired or anything like that. After this, he suggests assembling the men and then going up and down the ranks to get them all excited for war. So I guess he does see some need to maintain morale? Whatever. This assemblage is just an excuse for Homer to give his catalog of the ships where he lists who the men are and tells some of their attributes and stuff like that. And it's really long and boring, so we're going to skip it. However, following that theme, I am going to use this opportunity just to tell you who a few of the main characters are and how they fit in this story. Something more friendly for modern audiences than a full catalog. First, we have, of course, Agamemnon, the leader of the Achaean army. You should already be well familiar with him. He's strong-willed, but seems to lack imagination and is kind of hapless and stuff like that. Then we have Menelaus, who, as we learned, is Agamemnon's brother and husband of Helen, so this war is kind of for him. He and Agamemnon are good fighters in kind of a generic heroic way, so maybe forget what you might have seen in movies about them being out-of-shape old men or whatever. Achilles, of course, probably also needs very little introduction. He's young and he's brash, and he's by far the best fighter in the war. I will say that thing about him being invulnerable everywhere except his heel isn't a thing in the Iliad, but still, nobody in this story even competes with him. Then there's Odysseus, who we've already seen is the cleverest of the Achaeans, also of course the eventual hero of the Odyssey. Kind of pairing with him is Nestor, the oldest hero. Plot-wise, he and Odysseus are kind of used interchangeably as voices of reason who step up and give good advice, but a common distinction I've seen is that Odysseus is the cleverest one and Nestor is the wisest one. Nestor is also famous for giving really long speeches about the old times. Diomedes is one you might not have heard of if you aren't actively into Greek mythology. He's often considered the second best Achaean fighter, and plot-wise is used as kind of a second-string Achilles, which might be why you don't hear much about him. You'll understand as we go on. And finally, the Ajaxes. Great Ajax is another one I've heard called the second greatest Achaean fighter. He's this really huge guy who most often defends or rescues other characters. Think of him as kind of a tank character. I think he might have the most brute strength, and he's considered noble but not super quick-witted. Then there's Lesser Ajax, a smaller, more agile version who fights alongside him. And honestly, you'd be fine if you lived your life without knowing he existed. Really, the only reason he's remarkable and the only reason I bring him up is because he has the same name as Great Ajax and you kind of have to keep them distinct from each other. Then continuing the formula, Iris comes in and tells the Trojans to all rush out of their city. It's kind of weird. You would think they have this giant walled city, they would just stay in and defend it, but they're always rushing out onto the battlefield. So they rush out now to go out and fight, and this is an opportunity to catalog them as well. The first one we have is Hector, who's the greatest Trojan fighter. It seems like he outclasses everybody except Achilles, and he's kind of this ongoing nightmare for the Achaean troops. His name has actually become a synonym for a bully. But even though the Achaeans don't like him, he's depicted as one of the most noble, family-oriented, duty-oriented people in the story. Really likable guy. Then there's his brother Paris, who, as we know, ran off with Helen. He's kind of a coward. He's an archer. Nobody really likes him. You'll see more of him starting in the next chapter. Then there's Aeneas, who I think is the second greatest Trojan warrior. We don't focus on the Trojans a lot, so we don't see a ton of him. The only reason I bring him up is he's the hero of the Aeneid, which is a Roman epic kind of trying to co-opt the Iliad. Oh, also there's Priam, who's the king of the Trojans, but he's not a fighter. You'll see what he's all about soon. Pretty important character. So that's book 2. The actual action is pretty short. It's just Agamemnon trying to inspire his army, that collapsing, and Odysseus bailing him out. So that seems to be the big thing in this story. We're seeing the ongoing issue of Agamemnon being a little bit of a hapless leader. He's either hot-headed or makes these kind of impulsive bad decisions. And one by one, Odysseus and the Nestor step up and bail him out. It happens a lot. It's not consistent. He's not a total idiot. He's really heroic sometimes. Sometimes he has good ideas. But this is a formula in this story. And then, of course, we also see Thersites being put in his place. So whatever we're going to take from that. That wraps up book 2. In book 3, the two armies are going to converge, and I shouldn't be giving away too much when I say that they halt the battle and they have a big duel between Menelaus and Paris. I think most people are familiar with that. So that's what we have going to next time. We're not going to see another one of these for a while. I do make other videos around these, but I'm just going to slowly eke these out. If they start getting more popular and I can put these out without devastating my channel, or there's just more demand for them, maybe I will. But we'll probably be seeing these every few months. So thanks for joining me. If you made it this far, you're one of the great super fans, and I love you, and have a good day, everybody.